Okay, let's continue with our special topics on research ethics. This is topic or module number 6 on informed consent. Informed consent is very, very important and required component of any research projects involving human subjects. We said last time in our module on RB review that regardless of the kinds of RB review that your proposed research might receive, either it is exempt review or it is expedited review or full board review, all kinds of RB reviews require that your research projects, when being executed, must include a process of informed consent. And the reason that informed consent is to be included is because subjects or people here, they have the right to expect that researchers will treat them as autonomous individuals, and also respect their decisions about whether or not to take part in the research, and to respect their decision, that is, those prospective research participants, their decision about what information they will or will not share with others. So this essentially, all these principles, or all these philosophical principles behind the motive of informed consent basically stem from the ethical principles of respect for persons, as we mentioned in previous modules. And all these expectations are met in the process of informed consent, as thorough as possible for the informed consent process to be. And also, a very important point here is that the informed consent must be presented in the language that is understandable to research subjects, which we'll return in our last slide of this module. Now, the consent process. Federal regulations about informed consents list elements of information that a researcher must provide to subjects. And the regulations divide the elements into two categories. The first category includes basic elements to be provided to all subjects. And the second set of categories, or the second category, includes elements that must be provided when appropriate. So let's start with basic elements in informed consent. The first basic element is a statement that the study involves research. That is to tell your subjects that this is an academic research or is a commercial research as defined in federal regulation, which we discussed in our very first module on research ethics. That statement should also be serving as an explanation of the purpose of the research. You should do your best to tell participants what the goal of this research is. You must explain in that statement the expected duration of participation, that is how long the research study is going to be, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours. You must describe the procedures to be followed, what is to be done at first, what is to be done after that, and what is to be done in the end. And if this is especially true for medical research, if there's any experimental procedures, say for example an innovative procedure, an innovative treatment plan, or a new drug that is just being FDA approved, any of those kind of experimental nature or procedures of experimental nature, you must tell the participant. This is slightly less true um, in social research. Later on, we'll be talking about experimental design in our research methods modules. Um, Typically, when social scientists are conducting experiments, they will avoid, given RB approval, to tell participants um, what kind of manipulation, that is, what kind of experimental procedures are involved in the procedure. And that's because, at least in social scientific experiments, telling participants, what is experimental, what is control, very often will lead participants to respond differently, or to which will eventually and very often jeopardize the purpose of the study. So that is why you know researchers tend to withhold that information about experimental procedures in many social sciences, not all, in many social scientists, and provide a debriefing consent at the end of the study, telling participants that, okay, so what you have just participated is in fact an experiment, and this is the manipulation. And of course, all that withholding information and providing debriefing consent must be approved by RB before the researchers can carry out such an experiment. Okay, so another basic element in informed consent is a description of any reasonable or any reasonably foreseeable risks or discomforts that subjects might experience. And as we discussed before, all these risks and discomforts include physical and psychological um, types. So you must be very considerate and think very thoroughly what possible negative effects might have to a subject's physical state and their psychological state. A third basic element of informed consent is a description of any benefits to the subject or which may reasonably be expected from the research. Right? So here, in other words, you must let the prospective participants to compare the potential risks with the potential benefits, so that they can make an informed consent, or to reject participating in the research, right? So you must you must give prospective participants, a reasonable foundation for them to make decisions. The fourth basic element in informed consent is a statement describing the extent to which confidentiality of records identifying the subject will be maintained. In the next class, we'll be talking about confidentiality and privacy, but here, just so you know that a good informed consent must tell participants that your data will be kept in, for example, a password protected computer, and who are the people that have access to your data, and whether or not we as researchers will collect any personally identifying information, and if we do, how are we going to process those information, etc. Right? So to let the prospective participants know the measures that researchers would take to keep their data confidential, or information provided confidential. The fifth basic element in good informed research is when research involving more than minimal risks. Researchers must provide explanation as to whether any compensation and an explanation as to whether any medical treatments are available if injury occurs. So this also is most likely relevant to medical research. Some social scientific research might might have the possibility of incurring some physical risks, If that's the case, then you must tell participants, whether or not they would anticipate any risks of being physically injured. And if they do, what kind of treatments will be provided. A sixth element that's considered basic elements is an explanation of whom to contact for answers to questions pertinent to the research. That will usually be the researcher in charge of the study. The informed consent should also provide explanation of the contact information if participants have questions about their rights. That usually will be RRB. So on the consent form, researchers must provide the contact information, for example, the physical address, email address, or telephone number of RRB. Lastly, the informed consent must provide information on who to contact in the event of research-related injuries to subjects. That will usually be the campus medical center, or in the case of psychological discomfort, counseling services or information about counseling services will also be provided. It is also very important that researchers include a statement that participation is voluntary and refusal to participate will not incur any kind of penalty or the loss of benefits. And that is, if you recall, because the the Nuremberg Code states that participation in research must be voluntary, right? So the informed consent must reflect that spirit or stipulation. The informed consent should also be very clear that informed consent at the start of the study does not mean that the participant is in any way obligated to finish the study. In fact, participants have the right to discontinue with participation at any time without any penalty or any loss of benefits. So the informed consent form should also make this point very, very clear. Now, in addition to these basic elements that must be included in any informed consent forms, some additional elements would also be included, well, when appropriate. For example, a statement that a particular treatment or procedure may involve risks to subjects. That is, while the entire study, generally speaking, has very minimal risk, but because a certain treatment or procedure included, that particular treatment or procedure has risks. And if that's the risk, and that if that's the case, then researchers must make this known to participants. The researchers must also tell participants if, again, this is additional, whether or not researchers anticipate circumstances under which they will terminate the research. This again is mostly common in medical research, or in very few social science research, to my knowledge, because the reason that termination of research by researchers is more common in medical research is because medical research usually involves more procedures. For example, the availability of very expensive equipment, or the approval status of new drugs, etc. Right? So if anything, any circumstance changes, then researcher must terminate the research. Or if the researcher is reallocated to another university, then this research must also terminate. Um, this again is, I wouldn't say optional, but when you design informed consent, you must consider this too. That is, are there any consequences if subjects are going to decide to withdraw from research? So previously we said that subjects will not be penalized or will lose any benefits if they decide to withdraw from research. Here the statement says, the consequences are most likely to be relevant to um, the result of the study or any impact of the research on other people. Again, this is mostly relevant to clinical research. So, for example, if a researcher is testing the effect of new drugs and these new drugs are in urgent need by other patients, then if subjects who initially agree to participate in research decide to withdraw from research, then researchers could consider letting these subjects know that your withdrawal could potentially have some impact, not necessarily negative, right, on the testing of the drug which are needed by other people. Um, it is often encouraged that researchers include the anticipated sample size, that is, the approximate number of subjects to be involved in the study. As we said earlier, informed consent is not valid unless the researcher makes sure that a prospective subject understands the information that has been provided. So that's the key word here, right? So you can give informed consent, for example, in Chinese, to a group of, say, American subjects. That would not be considered appropriate or even legal because you don't know whether those American subjects understand Chinese, the language in which the informed consent is conducted. So if no proof is submitted that that group of participants understand the language in the consent form, then the consent form actually is considered void. It does not have legal binding effects. Um, Even when researchers conduct their studies with populations whose native tongue is the language that is being used to inform consent, researchers must still consider the characteristics of the proposed subject's population's level of cognition and literacy. For example, right, if you were planning to study homeless people on this island, you can't expect them to, well, you can expect them to understand English, but then you cannot expect them to understand very, scientific jargons, for example, and you cannot write your informed consent in very long sentences. In other words, you must adapt your informed consent to the anticipated level of comprehension of your prospective subject pools. Another consideration is the complexity of information, right? You must keep everything simple. If, for example, you're dealing with kids, right? Because kids, or American kids, even they can perfectly understand the amount of words they were able to, master at their age level. They probably cannot understand very complicated ideas, so you must tune down the complexity of the information you're going to present to them. Also, you must consider whether or not the participants are in a good, I should say appropriate emotional state to understand consent form. Because very often emotions, or very intense emotions, can bias participants' decision, sometimes not to their benefit or not in their favor. Also, you must consider the setting under which the consent process occurs, right? You cannot, for example, give them a very short time frame to provide a consent. You must provide them, ideally enough time and in a room that's quiet and that and a room also they are not being monitored for them to complete the consent process. In other words, you as the researcher should not exert undue influence or pressure or duress for the participants to provide informed consent. Lastly, informed consent is always an ongoing process. That is, subjects' initial decision of participation are not binding. We said this before. Participants should have the right to terminate research at any point without any penalty or loss of benefits. Even in some cases, even after the study is completed, participants can still contact researcher and tell them that, hey, upon second thought, I decide that I withdraw from the study and you cannot use my data. And if that's the case, researchers must comply with that request and abandon and delete the data from that particular participant. Okay, so that will be our module on informed consent. We'll continue tomorrow.